20 experts couldn't solve it, but the humble cleaning lady cracked it in 1 minute, then the millionaire CEO's reaction. The struggles of experts versus the janitor's unlikely solution. In a high-tech office building, there was a growing sense of frustration among the engineers of Carter Tech. They had been working tirelessly for hours, yet the problem they were attempting to solve seemed to be insurmountable. The digital whiteboard was covered with complex equations, each one more perplexing than the last. The engineers, some of the brightest minds in their field, could not find the solution, no matter how hard they tried. Richard Carter, the CEO of Carter Tech, stood behind a glass wall, silently observing the engineers. His brow was furrowed, and his jaw was clenched with frustration. The team had been at this for hours, and it was clear they were on the verge of giving up. He knew that failure wasn't an option, especially with the high-stakes project they were working on. If they didn't crack this issue soon, it could jeopardize the entire deal with their investors. As the shouting behind the glass wall grew louder, Valentina, a cleaning lady at the company, was going about her usual routine. With a mop in hand and earbuds in her ears, she quietly went about cleaning the floor, her thoughts distant from the chaos in the meeting room. But she kept one earbud out, as she always did, to stay aware of her surroundings. She had been working at Carter Tech for years, and while she wasn't privy to the technicalities of the engineers' work, she had developed a keen sense for understanding what was going on around her. Suddenly, the door to the meeting room flew open. 3 engineers walked out, their faces exhausted and defeated. The last one carried 2 pizza boxes, his shoulders slumped, and he looked like he would trade his degree for a bed. They all piled into the elevator, leaving behind an air of failure. Valentina, still wiping the floor with a quiet determination, walked past the door, glancing at the whiteboard with its complex formulas. She stopped for a moment, a thought flickering in her mind. With a sigh, she muttered to herself, "Look at this mess. They couldn't even bother to erase their failure." She jokingly picked up a cloth and wiped the corners of the whiteboard, but as she did so, her eyes caught a glimpse of the equation at the center of the board. It wasn't the most sophisticated thing she had seen. In fact, she could tell there was a simpler way to approach the problem. Valentina wasn't a scientist. She didn't have a PhD or even a degree, but she had a sharp mind for problem solving. She took a step back, eyes narrowing as she processed the formula. "Wait a minute," she thought. "This is too complicated for no reason." In that moment, she grabbed a red marker and, without really thinking, started scribbling a new approach under the original one. A small tweak here, a little change there, and a few diagonal lines across the formula. Within less than a minute, a new math path had appeared beneath the original. It was simple, elegant, and most importantly looked like it would work. Valentina took a step back and smirked, feeling like she had just pulled off a little magic trick. She glanced at her mop, still leaning in the corner, as if it were her partner in crime. "That's done," she said to herself, satisfied with her work. She was about to turn around and leave when a voice from behind her stopped her in her tracks. "Who did this?" The voice was sharp, full of authority. Valentina jumped, startled by the sudden interruption. Richard Carter, the CEO, was standing in the doorway. He had been watching her for a few moments, and his eyes were now fixed on the whiteboard. He seemed both intrigued and confused, his usually icy demeanor softened by a flicker of curiosity. "Was it you?" he asked, walking into the room slowly, his eyes still scanning the formula. Valentina, caught off guard but not backing down, shrugged nonchalantly. "No, it was Maria Clara," she quipped, pointing to the mop in the corner as if it had somehow done the work. Richard raised an eyebrow, his serious face showing a hint of amusement. "Silence," he muttered, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Just kidding, it was me." He stepped closer to the board, his gaze shifting between Valentina's face and the equation. It was clear he was trying to process what he was seeing. This was a formula the experts had been struggling with for hours. They had been running tests, analyzing data and brainstorming ideas, but none of them had come up with this solution. "Do you know what this means?" Richard asked, his voice now a little quieter but still full of surprise. "You don't need to keep importing lab geniuses. Maybe you should let the janitors try once in a while." Valentina leaned against the cleaning cart, pretending not to care. "Maybe they're too busy trying to look smart," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I guess they didn't notice the obvious." Richard stared at her for a moment, almost as if he was measuring her words, and then let out a quiet laugh. It was the first time in a long while he had laughed without thinking about the weight of his responsibilities. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked after a brief pause, his voice serious again. Valentina didn't seem like the kind of person who would have a background in advanced mathematics. I studied at university for 2 years, Valentina replied, her tone casual. Had to stop, though. Couldn't afford it. You know how that goes. Her eyes met his for the first time, and there was a small spark of something more than just simple words. Though I guess you wouldn't know, you're rich. Richard's eyes flickered with surprise at her directness. For the first time in months, someone had spoken to him like that, without fear, without flattery, and with a little bit of sarcasm. Introducing Valentina, the cleaning lady. Valentina had always been a quiet presence at Carter Tech. As a janitor, she wasn't part of the high-level meetings, nor was she involved in the project discussions that took place in the sleek conference rooms. She was just the cleaning lady, the person who swept the floors and wiped the windows, the one whose presence often went unnoticed by the busy professionals around her. But that didn't mean she didn't notice things. In fact, Valentina was keenly aware of the atmosphere in the office, the tensions that built up in the hallways, and the subtle clues about what was really going on behind the closed doors of the boardrooms. She had heard the engineers' frustration before, had witnessed their heated debates about complex problems that seemed to elude even their sharpest minds. And she had always wondered how they could struggle so much with issues that seemed so clear to her. When she walked into the meeting room that day, mop in hand, and with her usual casual grace, she hadn't expected to be caught in the middle of a breakthrough moment. But as she wiped the whiteboard clean, the complexity of the problem began to reveal itself to her in a way that no one else had noticed. Valentina wasn't an expert in artificial intelligence or high-tech systems. She didn't have the technical knowledge that the engineers had, but she had a mind that was quick to find patterns, quick to spot inefficiencies, and quick to see the simpler solution. She had learned to do that in her everyday life, growing up in a neighborhood where resources were limited. And solving problems wasn't always about having the most expensive tools or the most formal education. It was about being resourceful, thinking outside the box, and trusting your instincts. So, when Valentina looked at the whiteboard and saw the tangled web of equations, her mind immediately saw the solution. A simple substitution here, a minor adjustment there. Her approach wasn't based on years of study or technical expertise, but rather on a natural ability to simplify complex problems. As she stood there, marker in hand, making small adjustments to the equation, she felt a sense of satisfaction. The solution appeared so effortlessly to her that she didn't even realize the magnitude of what she had just done. But as soon as Richard Carter, the CEO of Carter Tech, entered the room and saw her work, it became clear that this was no ordinary moment. Richard had been quietly observing the engineers' struggles from behind the glass wall, and when he entered the room and saw what Valentina had done, his initial shock was palpable. This wasn't the kind of breakthrough one expected from a cleaning lady. He stood in silence for a moment, taking in the new formula she had written underneath the original one. It was simple, elegant, and most importantly seemed to solve the problem that had baffled the engineers for hours. Valentina, ever the one to play down her achievements, looked at Richard with a casual shrug. "It's nothing," she said, trying to make light of the situation. "Just a little fix." Richard, however, wasn't convinced. He stared at her, his mind racing. He had seen brilliant minds struggle with the same problem, but here was this woman, someone who wasn't even part of the project, offering up a solution in under a minute. It didn't make sense, but it was undeniable. The more Richard thought about it, the more he realized that what Valentina had done wasn't just about solving an equation. It was about seeing the problem in a way that no one else had. It was about approaching the issue without the weight of expectations or the constraints of academic training. And that, he thought, was the true brilliance. For the first time in a long while, Richard was faced with something that challenged his own understanding of what made someone valuable in the workplace. He had always believed that the smartest people were those with the most degrees, the most technical expertise, and the most experience. But now, here was someone whose job was to clean the floors, who had solved a problem in a way that none of his experts had even considered. Richard knew that this was a turning point. Valentina had just proven that intelligence and problem-solving weren't always about the fancy degrees or the polished resumes. Sometimes the best solutions came from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people who made the biggest impact weren't the ones who fit the typical mold of success. The more he looked at Valentina, the more he realized that she was much more than the cleaning lady. There was something about her, something that went beyond her job description. She had a mind that saw solutions where others saw only complexity. She had a perspective that was fresh and untainted by the constraints of traditional thinking. And Richard couldn't help but feel a strange sense of admiration for her. "Do you want to come to the meeting tomorrow?" Richard asked, his voice suddenly more serious. Valentina raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he meant. "You solved the problem after all. We'd like you to explain it to the team. They could learn something from you." Valentina hesitated. She had never been part of any official company meeting, let alone one with the high-ranking engineers and executives at Carter Tech. But there was something about Richard's request that intrigued her. Maybe it was the challenge, or maybe it was the opportunity to prove that she wasn't just a janitor, but someone with real insights to offer. After a moment of thinking, she shrugged again, her trademark humor coming through. "Sure, as long as I can bring my mop along," she said with a smile. Richard, not one to joke often, found himself chuckling at the remark. It was refreshing, in a way, to be around someone who wasn't trying to impress him or play by the rules. Valentina was just herself, unapologetically and refreshingly real. As Richard watched her leave the CEO's surprise, the next day, the meeting room at Carter Tech was filled with the usual buzz of engineers and managers, all talking through complex technical problems, their voices growing louder as the hours wore on. Richard Carter, the CEO, sat at the head of the table, a tablet in his hands as he reviewed the latest reports. His mind, however, wasn't entirely focused on the documents in front of him. He kept finding himself thinking about the previous day, about Valentina. How could someone so outside the typical mold of a corporate professional come up with such a brilliant solution? It didn't make sense to him. Valentina had no formal training in engineering, no technical background that would explain how she had solved a problem that even his top engineers had struggled with for hours. And yet, she had done it. The solution was so simple, so elegant, that it made him wonder how many other experts were missing the point by overcomplicating things. As the meeting progressed, Richard's thoughts wandered back to Valentina. He kept replaying the moment when he saw her working on the whiteboard, her casual confidence and her unassuming approach to problem-solving. For the first time in a long time, Richard realized that the traditional approach to problem-solving, relying on credentials, experience, and formal training, wasn't the only way. That's when it hit him. Valentina wasn't just the cleaning lady. She was an outsider in the best possible sense. She didn't carry the weight of corporate norms or academic traditions. She wasn't trying to fit into the box of what was expected. Instead, she was a breath of fresh air, bringing a perspective that no one had thought to consider. His mind raced with ideas. How could he harness this raw, untapped potential? He needed her input. He needed to find a way to integrate someone like her into the company. Someone who could challenge the status quo and bring new perspectives that the engineers and executives had become too entrenched to see. The meeting continued, but Richard's focus shifted. He had made up his mind. Valentina would be part of the team, and he wasn't going to wait for another serendipitous moment. He needed her there, and not just as a janitor. Later that afternoon, as the team wrapped up the meeting, Richard made his move. He stepped into the hallway, found Valentina mopping the floor just outside the conference room, and walked toward her. She looked up from her work, noticing his approach, but before she could speak, Richard cut her off. "Valentina, I need to talk to you about something," he said, his tone serious. She raised an eyebrow, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "What's up, boss?" Richard hesitated, unsure of how to begin. He knew she wasn't the type to be impressed by flattery or fancy titles, so he skipped the pleasantries. "I want you to join the team. Not just as a janitor, but as an official member of the project team. We need your insight. We need your fresh perspective." Valentina blinked, clearly taken aback by the request. "Me? But I don't know anything about tech or AI or any of that stuff," she replied with a nervous laugh. "I'm just a cleaning lady." Richard shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's exactly why we need you. You're not bound by the same assumptions or limitations that the rest of us are. You think differently, and that's exactly what this team needs." Valentina stood there for a moment, processing his words. She had never imagined herself in such a role. Sure, she had always been good at solving problems, but she had never thought of herself as someone who could contribute to a high-level project. But something about Richard's sincerity made her pause. He wasn't offering her a promotion or a fancy title, he was offering her a chance to be part of something bigger. "Okay," she said slowly, still unsure. "But only if I can bring my mop to the meetings." She grinned, trying to lighten the moment, but Richard could see the nervousness in her eyes. He laughed, the sound genuine. Of course. And I'll even let you sit near the projector, he joked. You can press the buttons whenever you like. Valentina smiled at his willingness to embrace her humor. It was a side of Richard she hadn't seen before, and it made her feel a little less out of place in such a high-pressure environment. She had always been able to make people laugh, even in the most awkward situations, and for some reason Richard seemed to appreciate it. All right then, she said, her voice more confident now. I'll give it a shot. But don't expect me to wear a suit. I'm keeping my uniform. Richard nodded, more than happy to accommodate her request. Deal. As Valentina walked away, pushing her cart down the hallway, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. This was the beginning of something new, something that could shake up the company in ways he hadn't even imagined. And in that moment, he realized that what he needed most was someone like Valentina, someone who didn't conform to the usual expectations, someone who could offer the team a new way of thinking. It was a gamble, but Richard had learned long ago that sometimes, a chance encounter with the CEO. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Carter Tech boardroom was charged with anticipation. The engineers and directors were buzzing, papers were shuffled, and everyone was preparing for another long and intense meeting. The new product, which had been under development for months, was nearing completion. But there were still several unresolved issues, most of them related to complex algorithms and artificial intelligence integrations, that seemed to evade even the brightest minds in the room. Richard Carter, the CEO, sat at the head of the table as usual, but today, something was different about him. He wasn't the stern, detached leader that everyone had come to expect. There was an air of anticipation about him, as if he was waiting for something or someone to shake up the routine. He'd made his decision, and now he was about to see what would happen. Valentina entered the room quietly, as always, her cleaning cart squeaking lightly on the polished floor. She didn't look out of place at all, in her standard blue uniform and sneakers, but her presence in the boardroom, with the entire team of highly paid engineers and corporate executives, was still unconventional. As she approached the table, she looked at the faces around her. Some of the top minds in the company, the ones who had spent countless hours working on this high-profile project, the ones who were supposed to have all the answers. But today, Valentina was the one with the solution. The engineers exchanged puzzled glances as she stood at the back of the room, leaning casually against her cleaning cart. They didn't know what to expect from her, but Richard had made it clear that she was to be included in this meeting. After a few moments of awkward silence, Richard cleared his throat, bringing the room's attention back to the matter at hand. All right, everyone, he said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of excitement. We've got an expert here with us today, someone who's going to offer us a new perspective on the equation we've been stuck on. Valentina stepped forward, adjusting her uniform and gathering her thoughts. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight like this. She had always stayed in the background, working quietly and efficiently, but today was different. Today, Richard had brought her here to share her insight. With a small smile, she addressed the room, her voice steady but filled with a touch of nervousness. I'm not a scientist, but I do know a thing or two about cleaning up messes, she said, making the room chuckle softly. And I think this formula you're all working on is a bit of a mess. It doesn't need to be this complicated. Sometimes you've just got to simplify things. The engineers exchanged skeptical looks. How could a cleaning lady, someone who had no technical background, possibly offer anything of value to the discussion? They were professionals. They had degrees from prestigious universities, and they had spent years honing their skills. Yet here was Valentina, suggesting that the solution was simpler than they had realized. Valentina took a step forward, moving toward the whiteboard where the complicated equation still loomed large. She grabbed a red marker, and without hesitation she began making small changes to the formula, drawing diagonal lines and adjusting variables. She didn't speak much, but her actions were clear. This was the solution, and it was right there in front of them, hiding in plain sight. Richard watched in silence, his arms crossed, his expression one of quiet contemplation. He had already seen the solution the day before, but seeing it again presented so casually, and with such confidence, reminded him of something he had forgotten over the years. Simplicity. The engineers, on the other hand, were still skeptical. Some of them exchanged whispers, unsure whether they should accept what was happening in front of them. They had spent hours, days, and even weeks on this problem, and now this janitor was solving it in a matter of minutes. Valentina, however, remained calm and collected. "It's not that hard," she said quietly, almost as if she were talking to herself. "Sometimes you just have to think about it differently." Her words struck a chord with Richard. He had spent years working in high-pressure environments, focusing on results and efficiency, and he had forgotten that sometimes the best solutions came from stepping back and looking at things from a fresh perspective. As Valentina finished making her adjustments, she stepped back from the whiteboard and looked at Richard. "That should do it," she said, her tone light but confident. "You might want to test it out, but I'm pretty sure that's the answer you've been looking for." Richard took a moment to absorb what had just happened. Valentina had just solved a problem that had baffled the best minds at Carter Tech. And she hadn't done it with a fancy degree or years of technical training. She had done it by simply trusting her instincts, her ability to see the world differently. For a brief moment, the room fell silent as the engineers stared at the whiteboard, at the elegant solution that had emerged from nowhere. Then, one by one, they began to nod, their skepticism slowly turning into admiration. This wasn't just some fluke. Valentina had just done something remarkable, and they knew it. Richard's gaze shifted from the engineers back to Valentina. "You really do think differently," he said, his voice tinged with respect. Valentina gave a modest shrug. "It's all about perspective, boss," she replied with a small smile. And with that, Richard knew that this wasn't just a one-time thing. Valentina had a gift for seeing things others couldn't, and that gift was something the company needed more than ever. As the engineers began to discuss how they could implement Valentina's solution, Richard found himself reflecting on what had just happened. He had learned an important lesson that day. Brilliance didn't always come in the form of a diploma or a job title. Sometimes, the first meeting, from janitor to observer. The next day, Valentina found herself walking into the Carter Tech conference room not as an outsider, but as someone who had been invited to contribute her thoughts. Richard had made it clear. She wasn't just there to clean up after the team's meetings anymore. She was now officially a part of the project, albeit as an observer at first. But Valentina had a feeling this wasn't just a small step, it was the start of something big. As she entered the room, her usual cleaning uniform and worn-out sneakers stood in stark contrast to the tailored suits and crisp shirts of the engineers and managers around the table. She pushed her mop cart to the side and stood near the door, unsure of what to expect. The engineers, some of whom had barely acknowledged her presence when she was just the janitor, now gave her curious glances. They were unsure what to make of her, but they were willing to hear her out. After all, she had solved the seemingly impossible problem yesterday. Richard, who had invited her to attend this meeting, motioned for her to sit. As she pulled out a chair and sat at the table, she could feel the weight of the room's attention on her. She wasn't just the cleaning lady anymore. She was Valentina, someone with a unique perspective that could help solve the company's biggest challenges. The room fell quiet as the discussion turned toward the latest developments in the project. Engineers were throwing out ideas, trying to crack the code behind the AI algorithm they were working on, but there was no clear breakthrough. Valentina listened closely, absorbing the technical jargon, trying to make sense of it all. She wasn't pretending to understand everything. There were plenty of terms and concepts that went over her head, but she could tell when something didn't add up. And it didn't take long for her to see the issue. She raised her hand, surprising everyone in the room. "If I may," she said, her voice calm but confident, "I think you're all overthinking it." There was a brief moment of silence. The engineers exchanged awkward glances, unsure how to react. After all, Valentina had no technical credentials. What could she possibly contribute to a high-level discussion on artificial intelligence? "Could you clarify?" Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. He wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, especially after the breakthrough from the previous day, but he knew this wasn't going to be as easy as it seemed. Valentina smiled and stood up, moving toward the whiteboard. She pointed to the equations the engineers had been working on. "You've got all these complex equations," she said, tracing the lines with her finger. "But the answer is probably much simpler. You're trying to force the system to fit into a mold, but what if you just let it adapt? Sometimes the solution isn't about refining the formula, it's about rethinking the whole approach." The engineers were quiet. They had spent months working on the problem, but here was Valentina, with no formal training in the field, offering a completely different take. She didn't have the technical knowledge they did, but she had something they didn't, an ability to think outside the box. "I'm not saying I have the answers," Valentina continued, But I think we need to stop focusing so much on the math and start focusing on the way the system needs to behave in the real world. It's like cleaning a floor sometimes. Using 3 different cleaners just makes a bigger mess. But if you use the right one and approach it simply, it works. There was an audible pause in the room as the engineers digested her words. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged glances. Valentina's analogy, while simple, seemed to resonate. It wasn't about the complexity of the problem, it was about seeing the bigger picture. Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You've got a point," he said slowly. "The more we try to complicate things, the further we get from solving the issue." Valentina turned to face the team. "Sometimes we get so caught up in the details that we forget to step back and see the whole process. We need to simplify." The room remained silent as the engineers thought over what Valentina had said. For a brief moment, the weight of the project seemed to lift, and a new sense of clarity filled the room. They weren't there to complicate things further, they were there to find the simplest, most effective solution. Richard broke the silence. "I think it's time to rethink how we approach this." He stood up, signaling to the engineers that they needed to change their mindset. "Valentina's right. Let's take a step back and look at the problem from a new perspective. We'll focus on simplicity, what would make the system work, rather than what we think should make it work." The engineers began to nod, some of them scribbling new ideas on their notepads. Valentina watched as the mood in the room shifted. What had been a tense, frustrating atmosphere just moments ago was now filled with a renewed sense of purpose. As the meeting wrapped up, Richard turned to Valentina. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "That was exactly what we needed." Valentina smiled, feeling a rush of pride that she had been able to make a difference. She had been an outsider just a few days ago, but now she was an integral part of the team. The respect she had earned from the engineers and Richard was evident in the way they now looked at her. She had proven that no matter your background, if you were willing to think differently and challenge the status quo, you could offer value in ways no one expected. Valentina's backstory, the real story behind the genius. As the weeks passed, Valentina became a more permanent fixture at Carter Tech. She attended meetings regularly, offering insights that continually impressed the team. However, despite her increasing involvement, there was still much about Valentina that her colleagues didn't know. They saw her as a janitor-turned-consultant, but there was more to her than that. One afternoon, after another successful meeting, Richard decided it was time to get to know her better. They were sitting in his office, a place filled with sleek furniture and modern technology that seemed worlds away from the humble work Valentina had done just days before. Richard had just finished reviewing a report when he glanced up and noticed Valentina sitting across from him, her posture relaxed yet poised. "Valentina," he began, "you've been incredible to have around. Your ideas, your perspective, it's been a game changer. But I feel like there's more to you than what I've seen so far. What's your story?" Valentina hesitated for a moment, surprised by the question. She had never been one to talk about herself. Her life had always been more about surviving, getting by, and focusing on the present rather than dwelling on the past. But Richard's sincere curiosity made her reconsider. "Well," she began slowly, "I wasn't always cleaning floors." She smiled softly as if the thought amused her. "I started out studying engineering, actually. I was really passionate about it, always loved problem-solving, puzzles, anything that made me think. But life, as it often does, got in the way." Richard leaned forward, interested. "What happened?" Valentina looked down, as though recalling a memory from long ago. "My mom got sick," she said quietly. "She was the backbone of our family. Worked tirelessly as a seamstress, cooked for multiple households, and still found time to laugh with us at night. But when she got sick, everything changed. I dropped out of college to take care of her and my younger sister. Things got tight, and I just couldn't afford tuition anymore." Richard watched her closely, his heart heavy with empathy. "That must have been difficult," he said, understanding the weight of her words. Valentina nodded. "It was. But I don't regret it. My mom needed me, and I did what I had to do. I don't think I ever really saw myself as giving up. It wasn't quitting, it was prioritizing. And I've always loved learning, so I read everything I could: books, labels on medicine bottles, anything that kept my mind engaged. Even now, I still learn whenever I can." Richard was taken aback by her words. He had assumed that Valentina's life had been simple and straightforward. But in reality, she had faced tremendous challenges, and she had faced them head-on without ever seeking recognition or sympathy. Her ability to remain grounded despite her circumstances was something Richard deeply admired. "That's impressive," he said quietly. "You've really overcome a lot." Valentina shrugged as if it were nothing. "It's just life. You do what you have to do, but honestly, I never thought I'd be sitting here in a place like this." She gestured around the room, taking in the sleek office, the high-end furniture, and the state-of-the-art technology. This is all kind of surreal. I'm just a cleaning lady who loves solving problems." Richard smiled, but there was something deeper behind his smile now. He wasn't just impressed by her intellect or her unique perspective. He was beginning to understand how much heart Valentina had. She didn't just solve equations, she solved real-life problems with grace, resilience, and a humble strength that was rare to find in a corporate environment. "You know," Richard said thoughtfully, "there's a lot of people in this company who would be in awe of what you've accomplished. But I think what impresses me most isn't just your intelligence, it's your ability to stay true to who you are, no matter where you are. That's a rare gift." Valentina smiled at him, a soft and genuine smile that conveyed everything she felt without needing to say a word. "I don't know about rare. I just try to keep my feet on the ground. I've learned that it's not about titles or degrees. It's about doing what you love, even if it means taking a different route than everyone else." Richard paused, absorbing her words. For years, he had focused on the prestige of titles, the importance of credentials, and the recognition of success. But now, he was beginning to see that the true value of a person wasn't measured by their accomplishments on paper. It was measured by their resilience, their passion, and their willingness to contribute to something greater than themselves. Valentina had taught him that. The silence between them grew comfortable as Richard thought about how much his perspective had changed since meeting her. She had challenged his assumptions, had made him question what really mattered in life. It wasn't just about the bottom line or the next big project. It was about recognizing the worth in people no matter where they came from or what they had. Finally, Richard spoke again. "I'm glad we had this talk, Valentina. I think I understand you a little better now, and I think I know what you bring to the table." Valentina's smile widened, but there was something in her eyes that made Richard realize how much she had truly given up in her life. It wasn't just a matter of ambition, it was a matter of heart. "I'm not here to take anyone's place," she said, her voice steady. "I'm just here to help, to offer what I can." Richard nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude he hadn't expected. And that's more than enough. As the conversation, the CEO's growing perspective. Over the next few weeks, Valentina's presence at Carter Tech began to feel more natural. Her unique perspective, combined with her humility and practical thinking, started to change the way the team approached problem-solving. Richard, having witnessed her contribution firsthand, could see that the atmosphere in the office had begun to shift as well. The engineers were more open to ideas, more willing to step outside of their comfort zones, and they were beginning to recognize that there was more than one way to reach a solution. Richard had always prided himself on being in control, on knowing exactly what needed to be done and when. But Valentina's approach had shown him that control wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about being open to others and trusting that everyone, regardless of their background or expertise, had something valuable to contribute. The corporate world, as polished and structured as it was, could often be stifling in its rigidity. It was people like Valentina who reminded him that creativity often came from the most unexpected places. One afternoon, after a particularly intense meeting, Richard found himself walking down the hallway when he saw Valentina, her mop cart in tow. She was humming softly to herself, clearly content in her own world. As he approached her, he couldn't help but smile. She wasn't just a janitor anymore, she was a crucial part of the team, someone who had earned the respect of everyone around her. "How's it going?" Richard asked casually, his tone more familiar than it had been before. Valentina looked up, surprised but pleased to see him. "Oh, just another day, another floor to clean," she replied with a grin. "But the meeting went well, right?" Richard nodded. "Yeah, it went well. Actually, I think you helped more than you realize." Valentina shrugged, downplaying her role. "It's nothing, really. I just suggested simplifying things. Sometimes you just have to look at the problem differently." Richard smiled, stopping to look at her with a new level of respect. "That's exactly it, Valentina. You've shown me and the whole team that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones. And sometimes, people who are outside the system can see things we can't." There was a brief moment of silence, and for the first time, Richard felt as though he was seeing Valentina not just as someone who worked in the building, but as an equal. She wasn't someone who was there to follow orders, she was someone whose voice mattered. She had earned her place at the table, and Richard had learned to trust her instincts, just as he would trust any senior member of the team. "I've been thinking," Richard continued, his tone becoming more reflective. "You've done more for this company than I ever expected. You've got a gift, Valentina, not just with the work you've done, but with the way you think. Have you ever considered, well, what I'm saying is, we need someone like you in a more official capacity." Valentina paused, clearly taken aback by his words. "You mean like an official position? But I'm just a janitor." Richard shook his head, cutting her off. "You're more than that, Valentina, and we need more people like you, people who aren't afraid to challenge the norm, to see things from a different perspective. What you've brought to Carter Tech isn't something that can be taught in school or learned from a textbook. It's something much more valuable than that." Valentina wasn't sure how to respond. This was uncharted territory for her. She had never imagined that she could be part of the corporate world in such an official way. But there was something in Richard's voice, something in his eyes, that told her he wasn't just being polite. He genuinely believed in her. "I don't know," she said, her voice hesitant. "I'm not sure I belong in a corporate office. I like my cleaning cart. I like being able to work and think at the same time. It helps me clear my mind." Richard smiled. "I get that. But I'm not saying you have to give that up. I'm just saying you have the potential to do more than you ever thought possible." Valentina thought for a moment. She had never thought about leaving her job as a janitor. It wasn't the most glamorous position, but it had allowed her to support her family and keep her life moving forward. She didn't need a title to feel proud of her work, but this was different. Richard wasn't asking her to leave behind who she was. He was asking her to step up, to share her voice in a way that could help shape the future of the company. "I'll think about it," she finally said, her voice filled with uncertainty but also curiosity. "I'll think about it, Richard." Richard nodded, his expression softening. "No pressure, take your time. But just know, if you ever decide you want to step into a bigger role here, the door's open for you." As Valentina walked away, she felt a swirl of emotions: excitement, fear, and a sense of possibility she had never experienced before. It was strange, this new world she was stepping into. But for the first time, she felt like she was on the brink of something important. Richard watched her go, his heart filled with a sense of hope. Valentina had already changed the way Carter Tech operated, but now he believed Valentina's impact, more than just cleaning. Over the following weeks, Valentina's presence in the meetings grew more prominent. It wasn't just her participation in the discussions, it was the way she contributed. She didn't speak the language of corporate jargon or technical speak, but she didn't need to. Valentina's brilliance lay in her ability to simplify complex problems and see solutions that others missed. It wasn't about formulas, equations, or the latest trends in artificial intelligence. It was about clarity, perspective, and human insight. One afternoon, as the team grappled with yet another round of technical difficulties, Valentina observed the group working intently, faces glued to their screens and papers scattered everywhere. Richard was pacing, his mind working overtime as he tried to make sense of the latest complications in the algorithm. The engineers were whispering to each other, debating which direction to take, but none of them seemed to agree. The room felt heavy with tension. Valentina stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching the group in silence. She hadn't said much yet in this meeting, but she could tell that everyone was spinning in circles. They were overcomplicating things, and no one seemed to see it. Finally, she couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Have you tried taking a break?" she asked, her voice cutting through the room like a breath of fresh air. The engineers looked up, surprised. Richard paused, his brow furrowed, clearly frustrated. He gave her a questioning look. "Taking a break?" he repeated, as if the idea of stepping away from the problem was foreign. Valentina nodded, stepping forward with a smile. "Sometimes you get too caught up in solving the problem that you forget to step back and breathe. A change in perspective can do wonders." Richard hesitated, clearly not sure what to make of her suggestion. But then he saw the sincerity in her eyes, the calmness in her demeanor. Maybe they were overthinking things. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop trying to force solutions and let the team refocus. "I think she's right," Richard said finally, turning to the team. "Let's take 5, clear our heads, and come back to this." The engineers exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them objected. It wasn't the kind of break they would normally take, but there was something in Valentina's suggestion that felt right. They took a few minutes to stretch their legs, grab coffee, and talk informally. When they returned to the meeting room, the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt lighter, and suddenly the equations didn't seem so impossible. With fresh eyes, Valentina pointed out a small but crucial mistake in the algorithm that had been overlooked. It wasn't a groundbreaking idea, just a simple fix, but it was the kind of insight that could only come from someone who wasn't bogged down by the stress of the project. She saw the patterns where others saw only chaos. See, Valentina said with a grin, sometimes it's the smallest things that make the biggest difference. Richard was astounded. He couldn't help but feel proud of how far Valentina had come. A few weeks ago, she had been the cleaning lady. Now, she was the one offering the solutions that made everything else click. All right, Richard said, looking around at the team. Let's make it happen. Valentina's right. It's the small things that matter. As the meeting wrapped up and the engineers began implementing the changes, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. Valentina had shown him something important, something that couldn't be taught in any boardroom or university lecture hall. It wasn't just about the work. It was about how you approached it. As Valentina packed up her things and prepared to leave for the day, Richard pulled her aside for a moment. You know, I don't think I've ever told you this, but you've really changed the way we work around here, he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. You've brought something to Carter Tech that none of us even knew we were missing. Valentina smiled modestly, looking down at her feet. I'm just here to help, she said, shrugging. I'm not trying to change the world. I'm just trying to clean up a little mess along the way. Richard laughed, grateful for her humility. Well, if cleaning up messes leads to solutions like this, I think we could use more of you around. Valentina nodded, pushing her cart toward the door. You never know what you might find when you clean things up. Sometimes the best things are hidden in plain sight. As she left the room, Richard's thoughts lingered on her words. She had a way of seeing things that was so simple, so refreshing, and yet so profound. It was a lesson he would carry with him, that sometimes the best ideas come from the most unexpected places. And often, the people who are overlooked have the most to offer. Valentina's impact on Carter Tech had only just begun, but already, she had changed the company in ways that no one could have predicted. And as Richard watched her leave the room, pushing her cart down the hallway, he realized that Carter Tech wasn't just getting smarter, it was getting an unexpected invitation. One late afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Richard found himself looking out of his office window. It had been a particularly hectic day. The project was progressing, but not without its setbacks. His team was working harder than ever, and while they were making strides, the pressure of perfection still loomed over them. He sighed, his mind spinning as he tried to come up with a way to push through the bottlenecks they were facing. Then out of nowhere, a thought occurred to him. He hadn't had time to check on Valentina today. The last time they spoke, she had helped solve yet another tricky problem, and his team had moved forward because of her. But she had been quiet recently, perhaps keeping to herself, working on her own routine. He didn't want her to feel that she was just a secondary figure in the background. Richard knew that she didn't want any fanfare. She didn't want the spotlight, she just wanted to help. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to show his appreciation in a more personal way. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and headed out of his office. Valentina, as always, was in the hallway, mopping the floor with her usual calm energy. She barely looked up when she heard him approach, focused entirely on her task, humming a soft tune as she worked. Valentina, Richard called out gently, causing her to stop and glance up at him. Hey, boss, she said, smiling slightly. What's up? Richard paused for a moment, considering his words. He didn't usually mix personal gestures with business, but today felt different. There was something about Valentina that made him want to change that. I was wondering, Richard began, trying to keep his tone casual, if you'd like to join us for dinner tomorrow night. Just the team and a few of us from management. No work talk, just a casual meal. It's a way for us to thank you for all you've done for the team. Valentina looked at him, surprised. She hadn't expected this at all. She had been content in her role, contributing when needed, but the idea of joining the team for dinner, an event usually reserved for the higher-ups, was entirely unexpected. She was unsure how to respond, a bit nervous at the thought. Are you sure? She asked hesitantly. I'm just the janitor. Richard smiled warmly, his expression sincere. No, you're more than that. You've been an invaluable part of this team, and I think it's time we acknowledge that. You've earned your seat at the table, Valentina. Valentina felt a rush of emotions. It wasn't just the gesture that moved her, it was the recognition that came with it. It was the first time anyone had truly seen her for what she could contribute beyond her job description. The invitation wasn't just about eating dinner, it was about being included. It was about being valued for who she was, not just the title she carried. "Well, I can't say no to that," Valentina said with a smile, her nervousness giving way to genuine excitement. "I'll be there." "Great," Richard said, nodding with approval. "I'll make sure the dinner is casual, just a good time to unwind. Don't worry, there won't be any formalities." Valentina smiled, nodding in agreement. She had spent years learning how to survive in a world that often overlooked people like her. But now, she was starting to see that there was a place for her, even in this high-powered corporate world. And as Richard walked away, she felt a sense of pride in herself that she hadn't felt in years. The next evening, Valentina arrived at the restaurant, nervous but excited. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she was determined to be herself. As she entered the private dining area, she was greeted by the team, many of whom she had worked closely with over the past few weeks. They looked at her with a new respect, a recognition that hadn't been there before. Richard was the first to greet her. He smiled warmly, offering her a seat at the table. "I'm glad you could make it," he said, his tone genuine. Valentina returned his smile, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. "Thanks for inviting me," she said, sitting down. As the evening progressed, Valentina found herself at ease, surrounded by colleagues who were now more than just people she worked with. They shared stories, laughed about the day's challenges, and talked about things outside of work. It was the first time in a long while that Valentina felt like she belonged in a room full of people, not just because of her role, but because of who she was. She told stories about her life, her upbringing, and the moments of humor that had kept her going. The engineers laughed, and even Richard seemed to relax, his usually stiff posture softened by Valentina's easygoing nature. "I never realized how much we needed someone like you," one of the engineers said, raising his glass in a toast. "You keep the team grounded, and you remind us that it's okay to take a step back sometimes." Valentina laughed, shrugging modestly. "I just like to keep things simple. You all have your fancy equations, but sometimes it's the small, simple things that matter the most." The rest of the evening was filled with more laughter, more conversation, and a sense of camaraderie that Valentina had never experienced in a corporate setting. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just a bystander in this high-tech world, she was a part of it, contributing her own brand of wisdom. As the night came to a close, Richard approached her again. "I'm glad you came, Valentina. This company would be a lot less fun without you." Valentina smiled. "It's nice to be appreciated. I'm not used to this kind of thing, but I think I could get used to it." Richard grinned. "You definitely deserve to be here, and the unexpected viral moment." Valentina's newfound sense of belonging at Carter Tech continued to grow. She had earned the respect of her colleagues, and with each passing day, she became more involved in the projects. But as is often the case with success, it wasn't long before things began to take an unexpected turn. It all started with a casual moment in the hallway. Valentina had just finished her shift and was on her way out when she stopped to wipe down the project room windows. One of the interns, an eager young man who was always on his phone, didn't notice her approach as he casually scrolled through his social media feed. Valentina could have ignored it, but something about his expression caught her attention. The intern was watching a news story, and he was so engrossed that he didn't realize she was standing just a few feet away. Valentina leaned closer to see what he was watching, and the sight nearly made her drop her cleaning cloth. There in the middle of the screen was a photo of her smiling in her janitor uniform, standing by a whiteboard with her badge clearly visible. The caption read, "Cleaning lady solves billion-dollar problem at Carter Tech." Her heart sank as she realized what was happening. The intern, oblivious to her presence, muttered something about the genius cleaning lady before walking away. Valentina stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. How had something so private, so personal, ended up on the internet? It wasn't long before the viral video caught fire. News outlets, social media platforms, and tech blogs picked up the story. "Latina cleaning lady solves impossible tech problem" was the headline everywhere. The story spread like wildfire. It wasn't the breakthrough itself that people were fascinated by, it was the fact that someone with no higher education, no credentials in tech, had done what the best engineers at Carter Tech had failed to do. Valentina didn't know how to react. She was used to going unnoticed, working quietly behind the scenes. Now she was thrust into the spotlight, her every move being dissected by the public. It wasn't just a success story. It was a narrative that carried all the weight of stereotypes and prejudices. People mocked her, doubted her capabilities, and made cruel jokes about the janitor genius. At first, she didn't say anything. She kept to herself, continuing her work, but it was impossible to avoid the whispers around the office. The interns, the engineers, even the executives, all had something to say about it. And soon it wasn't just the tech world that was discussing her. News anchors, bloggers, and even late-night talk show hosts started chiming in. Some were supportive, applauding her intelligence and insight. But others were not so kind, dismissing her as a fluke or a publicity stunt. Richard had noticed the shift in the office dynamics. People who had previously treated Valentina with indifference were now talking about her. But this wasn't just admiration, it was a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and in some cases, resentment. He could see it in their eyes. It was as if they were all trying to figure out how someone like Valentina had become so valuable, and it made them uneasy. One day, he noticed Valentina in the break room, standing alone by the coffee machine. She was quiet, almost withdrawn, staring down at her phone. Richard approached her, sensing the weight of the moment. "Valentina," he said gently, "I wanted to check in with you. How are you holding up?" Valentina didn't look up right away. She wasn't sure how to express what she was feeling. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset, at least not in the way people might think. She was just tired. "I'm fine," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "Just trying to get through the day, you know, it's a bit much, that's all." Richard nodded, understanding the pressure she was under. "I know this whole thing has gotten a lot of attention, but I want you to know that you're not just a headline to me. You're not a cleaning lady genius. You're an integral part of this team. Don't let the noise outside get to you." Valentina smiled faintly. "It's hard not to, Richard. It's hard not to feel like people are judging me based on my job title and not on what I actually bring to the table. It's like they're saying that I don't belong here." Richard could see the pain in her eyes. She had always been the kind of person who shied away from attention. She didn't want to be celebrated or praised, she just wanted to contribute. And now, she had been thrust into a role that was beyond her control. "I understand," Richard said. "But you need to remember one thing, you belong here. You've earned your place in this company, not because of your background or your title, but because of what you've done. The solution you provided, the way you've helped this team, it's real, and no one can take that away from you." Valentina felt a lump in her throat as she looked up at him. "I never asked for any of this, Richard. I didn't want to be the center of attention. I didn't even want anyone to know I was capable of solving these problems." Richard placed a hand on her shoulder, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You didn't ask for it, but it's happening. And I'll make sure people understand that this isn't some kind of fluke. You're here to stay." That evening, Valentina sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through the overwhelming comments and messages online. Some were supportive, applauding her for her genius and her work ethic. Others were dismissive, making cruel jokes or questioning her abilities. The voices of doubt seemed louder than the voices of encouragement. But then she saw a message that stood out. It was from her mom, who had always been her biggest supporter, even when things were tough. "You've always been more than what they saw, Valentina. This is your time. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You've always been a fighter. Stay strong." Tears welled up in Valentina's eyes as she read her mom's words. For the first time since the whole viral moment had blown up, she felt a sense of peace. She had spent so many years doubting herself, trying to prove that she was more than just a janitor. But now, she realized that the world had already seen her for who she truly was, and it was time to the turnaround, strength in adversity. As time went on, Valentina continued to work alongside the engineers and management team at Carter Tech. Despite the viral attention, she never wavered from her core focus, solving problems and simplifying complex tasks. But it was clear that the attention was beginning to take its toll. There were moments when she would catch people whispering as she passed by or read snide comments in the break room, dismissing her as a fluke or a sideshow attraction. And while the praise for her intelligence was gratifying, it often felt shallow when it came from people who still underestimated her based on her background. The pressure from the outside world, coupled with the shifting dynamics inside the company, began to weigh heavily on Valentina. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and this new fame wasn't as glamorous as it seemed. She wanted to focus on her work, to contribute in meaningful ways, but there was no escaping the conversations about her that were happening behind closed doors. The media attention, while initially flattering, now felt like a constant reminder that she was more a subject of curiosity than a valued member of the team. One day, as she was leaving the office, Richard stopped her in the hallway. He had noticed how withdrawn she had become. The sparkle in her eyes that had been present when she first joined the company had dimmed slightly, and he could sense that something was off. "Valentina," Richard said gently, "can I talk to you for a moment?" Valentina stopped, surprised. "Sure, Richard, what's up?" "I just wanted to check in with you," he said, his tone sincere. "You've been doing great work, as always, but I can tell something's been bothering you. I know it's been a lot lately with all the attention, but I want you to know that you're not alone in this." Valentina sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I appreciate that, Richard, but it's not just the attention. It's the feeling that people don't really see me for who I am. They only see the janitor genius or the cleaning lady who solved a problem. It's like no one cares about the work I'm doing now or what I can contribute in the future. They just want to label me based on my past." Richard was quiet for a moment, processing her words. Then he placed a hand on her shoulder. "Valentina, I see you for who you are. You're not just someone who solved one equation. You're someone who changed this company's perspective. You brought us back to basics, showed us how to simplify things. And you've done it with humility and a sense of purpose that no one else here could match." She shook her head, not convinced. "But people are still judging me. They still see me as someone who doesn't belong. And it's hard to keep going when I feel like I'm constantly fighting to prove that I'm worthy." Richard's eyes softened as he looked at her. "You don't need to prove anything, Valentina. Not to anyone. You've already done what many people couldn't. And as for those who still don't see your value, well, that's on them. But you and I both know your worth." Valentina felt a surge of gratitude as she met Richard's gaze. For the first time in a while, she felt understood. The constant internal battle she had been fighting, the desire to prove herself, to gain respect, seemed a little less daunting when Richard expressed such faith in her. "I just don't know how to handle all this," she confessed, her voice quiet. "I don't want to let it distract me from the work. I don't want to be the cleaning lady who made it big. I just want to be Valentina." Richard nodded, understanding her desire for authenticity. "You are Valentina, no matter what anyone else calls you. And if you want, I'll make sure you're recognized for what you bring to the table, without the headlines or the labels. We're a team here, Valentina. We respect what you contribute, and that's what matters most." Her heart lightened at his words, and a smile tugged at her lips. "Thanks, Richard. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to know that you see me for who I am." "I always will," Richard said, giving her a reassuring smile. "And don't forget, you don't have to do this alone. If you ever feel overwhelmed or need someone to talk to, I'm here." Valentina nodded, her thoughts slowly beginning to shift. Maybe it wasn't about proving her worth to everyone. Maybe it was enough to just keep doing the work she loved and let the results speak for themselves. With Richard's support and the trust of the team, she could begin to let go of the need for external validation. Over the next few weeks, Valentina's confidence began to rebuild. She continued to contribute to the project, offering her insights without worrying about the opinions of others. She realized that her true value didn't depend on what people called her. It depended on what she could do, how she could help, and the impact she could make. The viral moment may have brought her fame, but it didn't define her. And as Valentina walked into the meeting room one day, greeted by nods and smiles from her colleagues, she knew that her place in Carter Tech had already been earned. No matter what anyone else thought, she had already proven that she was much more than just the label she had been given. The shift in her perspective didn't just help Valentina, it helped the entire company. The engineers, the managers, and even Richard had learned from her example. They learned that true success wasn't about titles, fame, or expectations. It was about hard work, humility, and a willingness to see things differently. Valentina wasn't just part of the team anymore. She was part of the final test, proving her worth. As the months passed, Valentina's contributions to Carter Tech continued to grow, not just in terms of technical input, but also in the way she bridged the gap between the engineers and the business side of the company. The team was thriving with a new sense of collaboration, and Richard had noticed something important. The simple, down-to-earth approach that Valentina brought to the table was something his team had needed all along. It was a fresh perspective, grounded in the real world, that helped them see their work in a completely new light. But just as things were settling into a new rhythm, Carter Tech was presented with a challenge that would test everything they had built. The company was up for a major pitch to a group of Silicon Valley investors, some of the most influential players in the tech world. The potential investment could propel Carter Tech to new heights, but there was one problem. The presentation wasn't going well. The team had been working on the presentation for weeks, but they just couldn't seem to get it right. The investors were skeptical, and their feedback was harsh. They weren't seeing the vision. Richard called an emergency meeting the night before the presentation, his face drawn with concern. The pressure was immense. This was a make-or-break moment for the company, and it seemed like they were missing something vital. Valentina arrived in the meeting room just as the team was gathered around the conference table. The tension was palpable, and everyone looked exhausted. Richard stood at the head of the table, staring at his laptop screen, clearly frustrated. "Everyone," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. "We've been working on this pitch for weeks, but it's not connecting with the investors. We need a new approach, and we need it fast." Valentina, who had quietly entered the room, stood near the back, unsure of what she could contribute. She had been invited to attend this meeting, as she had for all the others, but this was different. This was a pivotal moment for Carter Tech, and she wasn't sure how she could help in such a high-stakes situation. Richard noticed her standing there, her presence almost a calming force amidst the chaos. He looked at her and then at the rest of the team. "Valentina, you've been a part of every step of this project. You've seen it from the outside, from a different perspective. We need your help." The room went quiet. The engineers, the marketing team, and even the directors all turned to Valentina. She wasn't just the cleaning lady anymore. She was now a trusted voice in the company, and her input had earned the respect of everyone in the room. Valentina felt a surge of nervousness, but she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I'm not sure what I can add," she began, her voice calm but uncertain. "But from what I've seen, I think you're overcomplicating things. This pitch is all about one thing, connecting with the investors. You're presenting a product, yes, but you're not showing them why it matters. You're not showing them the real-world impact." She paused, looking around the room to gauge the reactions of the team. These investors, they're not looking for complex algorithms or technical jargon. They're looking for something they can understand, something they can believe in. They want to know how this technology is going to change lives. Richard leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on," he encouraged. Valentina continued. "What if we stopped focusing on the technical details for a moment and showed them the bigger picture? What if we simplified the message and made it personal? Instead of talking about what the technology does, we should talk about how it can make people's lives easier, how it can improve their everyday experiences. It's not just about the numbers, it's about the human impact." A few engineers exchanged looks, unsure of how they could simplify something so complex, but Richard's eyes lit up. "I think she's right," he said, turning to the team. "We've been so focused on making sure everything sounds perfect that we've lost sight of why we're doing this in the first place. We're not here to impress them with algorithms, we're here to show them how this can make a difference." Valentina's suggestion had shifted the focus of the pitch. Instead of drowning the investors in technicalities, they would focus on the human side of the technology, the tangible benefits it could bring to people's lives. It was a simple change, but it made all the difference. The team worked through the night, reworking the presentation to align with Valentina's vision. By morning, they had crafted a pitch that was not only clear and concise, but also compelling. They had found a way to convey their product's potential in a way that anyone could understand, even if they had no technical background. When the time came to present, Valentina stood off to the side of the room, watching as Richard and the team presented the new pitch to the investors. She had done her part. She had given them the clarity they needed, and now it was up to them to execute. The investors listened intently as Richard spoke, but it wasn't just the facts and figures that held their attention. It was the passion behind the words, the belief that this technology could truly change the world. By the end of the presentation, the investors were nodding, and Valentina could see the shift in their expressions. They were no longer just curious, they were excited. After a tense few moments, the head of the investor group stood up and clapped. "This is the kind of vision we're looking for," he said, smiling at the team. "You've shown us not just the potential of this technology, but the impact it could have. We're in, we'll invest." The room erupted in applause, and Valentina felt a rush of relief and pride. She had played a small but crucial role in helping the team see things differently, and it had paid off. The deal was sealed. As the team celebrated, Richard walked over to Valentina, his face beaming. "I knew we could do it," he said, his voice full of pride. "And you were the one who made it possible. You saved the pitch, Valentina." Valentina smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "I didn't save anything. I just helped you all remember what really matters." Richard grinned. "And that's why you're here. You've made Carter Tech not just smarter, but better. And I'm not just talking about the tech." Valentina looked around at the team, her heart full. This was more than just a company. This was a place where she had found, moving forward, a new beginning. With the successful investment secured, Carter Tech began to see the fruits of its labor. The company was propelled to new heights, both in terms of technology and culture. But none of it would have been possible without the quiet strength of one unexpected team member, Valentina. While the company celebrated their achievements, Valentina was still quietly processing everything that had happened in the past few months. In many ways, she still felt like the same person. She still showed up every day in her blue cleaning uniform, still carried her mop cart, and still hummed softly while she worked. But something had changed. She wasn't just the janitor anymore. She was a valued contributor to the team. The engineers, the managers, and even the executives now saw her as an integral part of the company, someone whose insights could not be overlooked. But despite the newfound respect, Valentina remained humble. She didn't want to let the attention get to her head. Her focus remained on doing her job well, whether that meant cleaning the office or helping solve complex problems. She knew she had something valuable to offer, but she didn't need the accolades. What mattered most was that her contributions were making a real impact on the people around her. As the company expanded, so did Valentina's role. Richard, recognizing her unique talents, invited her to more meetings, where her ideas continued to challenge the team to think differently. But Valentina didn't take the spotlight. She preferred to work behind the scenes, offering her perspective when needed, and letting her results speak for themselves. She had learned that true power didn't lie in recognition, it lay in being true to herself and her work. One afternoon, as Valentina was cleaning the windows in the project room, she overheard a conversation between Richard and one of the engineers. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their words were impossible to ignore. "You know, Richard," the engineer said, "I still can't get over the fact that Valentina solved that problem for us. She's not even an engineer, and yet she saw something we missed. It's honestly incredible." Richard nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Yeah, it's not just her intelligence, it's her way of thinking. She doesn't get caught up in all the technical details. She looks at the bigger picture, and that's something we need more of here." Valentina stood quietly, her heart swelling with pride as she listened. They didn't realize she was there, but their words meant more to her than anything else. She had earned their respect, not through her title or her credentials, but through her ability to contribute in ways that mattered. She had proven that everyone, no matter their background, had something valuable to offer. As the months passed, Valentina's role at Carter Tech evolved even further. Richard offered her a formal position within the company, not as a janitor or a special consultant, but as a full-fledged team member. She was tasked with overseeing a new department aimed at simplifying their products and making them more accessible to the everyday user. Her new title was Solutions Specialist, a title that felt both humbling and empowering at the same time. Valentina took to her new role with the same grace and humility that had always defined her. She didn't want to be treated any differently, but she was ready to step into a position where she could make a lasting difference. The company had changed her, but it had also given her the tools to make a broader impact, to influence the direction of Carter Tech in ways she had never imagined. Her journey had come full circle from a cleaning lady who was overlooked and underestimated to a valued team member whose ideas shaped the company's future. Along the way, she had learned that success wasn't about titles or recognition. It was about doing meaningful work, being true to yourself, and making a difference in the lives of others. One evening, as Valentina left the office after another long day, she couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. Her work wasn't over. There was still much to do, but she had found her place. She had found her purpose. And as she walked to her car, she looked up at the stars, thinking about everything she had accomplished and everything that was yet to come. The world had changed for her in ways she could never have imagined, and now she was ready to take on whatever came next. It wasn't just about cleaning up messes anymore. It was about making things a new chapter, moving beyond expectations. As Valentina settled into her new role at Carter Tech, She was no longer just the woman with the mop or the unexpected problem solver. She was a symbol of what was possible when people dared to think outside the box. In the few months since her role had shifted, Valentina had come to understand something crucial. The labels people put on others often limit potential. She had learned that success wasn't just about credentials, but about what you could bring to the table, and that anyone, no matter their background, had the ability to create change. The atmosphere in the office began to shift as Valentina's influence spread. The engineers, inspired by her ability to simplify complex ideas, started to think differently about their work. Instead of focusing on creating the most advanced, complicated solutions, they started focusing on creating products that people could truly use and understand. It was a shift from technical perfection to human practicality, and it made a profound impact on their success. One day, during a meeting where the team was discussing a new product launch, Richard turned to Valentina. "You know," he began, "I've been thinking a lot about how far we've come as a company. And a big part of that is because you've challenged us to think about the real-world impact of our work. Not just what's technically possible, but what's truly useful." Valentina smiled, slightly taken aback by the compliment. "I think we all need to remember that our work isn't just about impressing people with what we can do. It's about solving problems and making life better for the people who use our products." The room went quiet for a moment as everyone considered her words. Then, one of the engineers spoke up. "You've taught us something really important, Valentina. It's easy to get caught up in the technical stuff, but what really matters is whether or not it helps people. And you've shown us that." Valentina's heart swelled with pride. She had never sought to be recognized for her insights. She simply wanted to contribute. But as the team began to embrace the values she had brought to Carter Tech, she realized that her influence had become part of the company's DNA. She had helped shape their culture, and it was a culture of simplicity, humility, and purpose. As Carter Tech grew and evolved, so did Valentina. She had always been someone who could find solutions in the most unexpected ways, but now she had the opportunity to do so on a much larger scale. She was leading initiatives that aimed to bridge the gap between technology and the people who used it. Her department focused on making their products more intuitive, more accessible, and ultimately more impactful in people's lives. One evening, as Valentina was reflecting on her journey, she thought about how much had changed. The janitor who once cleaned floors was now making strategic decisions that would shape the future of the company. But what struck her most was the realization that her value was not in her position or title, it was in the way she approached problems, the way she saw the world. And as long as she kept that mindset, she knew she could continue to grow. That night, Richard invited her to a dinner with the senior leadership team. It was a celebration of the company's recent successes, but for Valentina, it felt like more than that. It felt like a recognition of everything she had contributed, not just to the company, but to herself. She wasn't just an employee anymore, she was a partner, someone who had helped shape the future of Carter Tech. As they sat down to eat, Richard raised his glass. "To Valentina," he said, his voice full of warmth, "for everything she's done for this company, for this team, and for reminding us all what really matters, making a difference." The team echoed his words, and Valentina felt a lump in her throat. She had never imagined a life like this. It wasn't about climbing a corporate ladder or gaining recognition. It was about finding purpose in the work, in the people, and in the impact they could have together. Later that night, as Valentina walked out of the restaurant, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She had found her place not just at Carter Tech, but in the world. She had proven that no matter where you start, or what others think of you, you have the power to change your own story. And that, she realized, was the greatest lesson of all. As she stood outside the restaurant, looking up at the city lights, Valentina made a promise to herself. She would never stop challenging herself, never stop learning, and never stop using her voice to make a difference. Because in the end, it wasn't about the job she had or the title she carried. It was about the lives she could touch and the legacy she could leave. And as she walked down the street, Valentina knew that this was just the beginning. The world was hers to shape, one step at a time. The true impact, a legacy of change. As the years went by, Valentina continued to make a profound impact on Carter Tech and its approach to innovation. The culture of the company had shifted significantly since her arrival, and it was all due to her ability to remind everyone that technology wasn't just about numbers, codes, and systems, it was about real people and real problems. She had become an influential figure not just in her department, but throughout the entire company. Valentina's journey had not been easy, nor had it been without doubt. There were moments when she had questioned whether she truly belonged, whether she could continue to rise above the stereotypes placed on her. But with each challenge, she had learned to trust in her own abilities and to embrace her uniqueness. Her story was a testament to the fact that success is not a straight line. It's full of twists and turns, but it is defined by perseverance, humility, and the willingness to learn. At Carter Tech, Valentina was now leading the charge in their most ambitious project yet, developing a technology that could bridge the digital divide and provide access to quality education in underserved communities. This project was close to her heart, as she had always believed in the power of education to change lives. It was also a natural extension of her own journey because, for Valentina, education had been her path out of hardship. Richard, who had become a close confidant and ally over the years, approached her one day in the office, his usual calm demeanor showing a rare hint of excitement. "Valentina," he said, "I think you're about to change the world." She laughed, not used to such grand statements. "Let's not get carried away." "No, really," Richard said, pausing to look at her. "This project, this idea, you've made it happen. You've made us believe that we can do it. I don't know if you realize this, but you've given everyone here a purpose beyond profit. You've shown us that we're not just creating products, but solutions that can truly change lives." Valentina felt a lump in her throat at his words. It was humbling to hear, but it also reminded her of everything she had been through to get here. The journey from a cleaning lady to a solutions architect wasn't one she had ever expected, but it was a journey that had led her to a place where she could truly make a difference. "Thank you, Richard," she said, her voice soft. "But this isn't just me, it's all of us. We've built something special here, a team that's willing to challenge the status quo and think differently, and that's what makes Carter Tech so unique. It's not just about innovation in technology, it's about innovation in how we see the world." Richard nodded, a look of pride in his eyes. "That's exactly why we need you, Valentina. You've taught us that being different isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to embrace. You've given us all permission to think outside the box, and that's why we're able to do things that no one else can." As the project began to take shape, Valentina found herself more and more immersed in the work that was closest to her heart. The technology they were developing was designed to be accessible, intuitive, and affordable, targeting regions where resources were limited, but the desire for learning was limitless. She knew firsthand the power of education, and she was determined to make sure that every child, no matter their background, had access to the tools they needed to succeed. Months later, Carter Tech launched the pilot program for their educational technology. The results were nothing short of extraordinary. Schools in underserved areas were now using Carter Tech's technology to provide students with the tools to succeed. The program wasn't just about access to information, it was about creating opportunities for kids who had once been left behind. And as Valentina watched the first classrooms implement the program, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It was then that she realized something important. The work she had done at Carter Tech was more than just solving technical problems or developing the next big product. It was about changing lives. It was about giving people the opportunity to thrive, regardless of where they came from or what they had. And that was the legacy she wanted to leave behind. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Richard asked Valentina to join him for coffee. They sat in a quiet corner of the office, looking out over the city skyline as the sun began to set. "You know, when I first met you," Richard began, his tone reflective, "I had no idea what kind of impact you would have. But now, looking back on everything we've accomplished together, I can't help but think that Carter Tech would never have become what it is without you." Valentina smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and humility. "I never expected any of this, Richard. All I ever wanted was to do my part to make things better, and somehow we've done that." Richard took a deep breath. "And you've done more than that. You've changed what it means to be part of this company. You've taught us all that success is not defined by where we come from or the job we do. It's about what we contribute, how we make a difference." Valentina's eyes filled with emotion. She had come so far, too far to ever forget where she had started. But now, she understood that the true measure of success wasn't in titles or recognition. It was in the impact you had on others and the legacy you left behind. Her journey wasn't just her own, it was shared with everyone who had helped her along the way. "I think we've only just begun," Valentina said, her voice steady but filled with hope. There's still so much we can do, so much we can change, and I'm not stopping until we've done all we can. Richard smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. I wouldn't expect anything less. And with that, Valentina knew that her work at Carter Tech was far from over. She was just getting started. The world was full of problems to solve, lives to change, and opportunities to create. And with her team by her side, there was no limit to what they could achieve. As she looked out the window, watching the sun set over the city, Valentina felt a sense of peace. She had found her purpose. She had found her place. And she had proven that no matter who you were or where you came from, you had the power to make a difference. It was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life.